Hey budget gardeners, Vita Loca here. Join me today as we do some garden cleanup. So let's go. It is the end of September and it is go time in terms of cleaning out perennial flower beds. We're on the south side of my house and behind me is a long sunny flower bed. And what I'll do is put up the dimensions of the flower bed on the screen just so you know the size of bed that we're going to be working with today. In the springtime, this flower bed looked beautiful. There were a ton of daffodils that were blooming and filling this area with color. And then later, as the season progressed, the peonies as well as daylilies were blooming. And they also just really filled in an area that normally doesn't have a lot going on during the winter months. And then as summer was coming near an end, the great blue lobelia as well as rudbeckia added a nice pop of color in this area. Well, now all the plants have started to go to seed, and it's a great time to be collecting seeds from those plants. It's also a great time to be cutting back plants that I don't want to self-sow. The birds have eaten most of the coneflower seeds, so I want to collect whatever seeds are remaining. And in regards to the great blue lobelia, I have a ton of that plant around my yard, and it produces so many seeds that if I don't cut back those plants now, I'm going to end up with a ton of those plants next year. There are a few other reasons why I like to cut back plants. For example, peonies. Peonies, if you don't cut them back, it can cause a lot of disease for the plant. There are a few plants that actually you want to cut back at the end of summer, early fall. And I'll put the list up on the screen. It's not all inclusive, but it's definitely a good list to start with so that you know which plants you should be cutting back at the end of the season. Another reason why I like to cut back my plants starting now is the leaves have started to fall, but they haven't fully dropped from all the trees. And I have a ton of trees in my yard. And if I don't cut back these plants now, what's going to happen is I'll have a ton of leaves on my lawn. And when I go to blow the leaves off my lawn into the flower beds and past the flower beds, they're going to get stuck inside all of those plants. I don't want that. I want to blow the leaves straight through out into the woods. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to be cutting back as much as we can right now to clean up these garden beds. So let me take you in closer and I'm going to show you the first thing we're going to tackle. Some of the plants that we're going to be cutting back today include the Stella daylilies. We have the great blue lobelia. There are echinacea, the purple coneflowers. There are a ton of peonies that are here. And by the way, any plants that have powdery mildew will not be added to my compost pile. But any plants that are healthy, I will be adding to the compost pile. And I'll be sure to cut those plants into small pieces before adding them to my compost pile. There will be some general weeding that will be done. When it comes to the lungwort or the pulmonaria, I'll be leaving the leaves there because they are adding some nice interest in the garden. And I want that to stay there for now. By the way, this bed is located on the south side of my house, and I recently cleaned up another flower bed that's also on the south side. I'll be sure to put a link to that video down in the description below. And when it comes to the plants in here, I wanted to mention a few things. Great blue lobelia is considered a native plant here where I live, and I made a video showing you the process for collecting the seed from a number of plants in here, including the great blue lobelia, as well as the purple coneflower. So if you are interested in collecting the seeds from those plants, definitely check out my seed collecting playlist down below. In regards to the lungwort or pulmonaria, I did make a video showing you my process for dividing that plant. It's so easy to divide that plant, so definitely check out that video in case you want to know how to do that. And peonies also like to be divided every so often, and I did recently divide some of my peonies. So if you're wondering how to do that, check out that video also. Over here is a pop-up bag, and I'm going to be putting any plant debris that is not diseased or doesn't have any powdery mildew into that bag. And all of the debris that's in there will go in the compost pile. So over here is the great blue lobelia. I'm going to be following it all the way down to the base of the plant, and I'm going to be using hand pruners, and I'm just going to be cutting the plant back. Other than being a home gardener, I also have a plant nursery on my property. It's up my driveway on the right-hand side. And I sell a lot of plants, and those plants are typically plants that I've divided out of my own landscape. The great blue lobelia has been a wonderful seller, I think partially because it's a native plant, partially because it blooms in the late summer, early fall, and that provides a lot of nice color in the yard. I have a ton of this plant in my plant nursery, so I don't need any more of these plants, which is why I'm trying to cut them back now, because I know that this plant seeds itself very prolifically. So if you have plants in your landscape that you find are kind of a nuisance because they seed themselves so prolifically, I recommend that you do the same thing that I'm doing, which is cutting them back before they go to seed and drop their seeds everywhere. I love the birds just like anyone else does. And I have so many plants in my yard that the birds can get the seeds from. So I'm not too concerned that I'm taking away their food source, because I know that they have plenty all around me. One thing I've learned with gardening is you definitely want to tackle projects in your yard when you're able to. In case you are wondering what the seeds of the great blue lobelia look like, I am going to put that up on the screen just so you can see what the seed pods as well as the seeds look like. The next plant that we're going to cut back is the echinacea or purple coneflower. And for these plants, I am going to be collecting the seeds because a lot of people that buy plants from me for my plant nursery often ask me if I have seeds. So I'd love to share them with other people. And all I'm doing is I'm just cutting back the spent blooms or spent blossoms. There aren't a ton of seeds on here because the birds have already taken a lot of the seeds, which makes me very happy. And I will be drying these seeds for about a week. These are the seed pods that I'm collecting, but I will have to harvest or pull out the seeds from the seed pods. And what I can do is put up on the screen what the seeds look like of the coneflower in case you're interested. Now last year, I did leave the seed pods on here throughout the winter months, and I ended up with so many coneflowers scattered all throughout this bed. I do like this flower bed to be a little bit more organized. I don't like the plants just growing randomly everywhere. So it was a lot of effort, and what I did was I dug up all of those coneflower seedlings. I ended up with a ton of them. They're all potted up and they just need to make their way down to my backyard plant nursery. I did put a peony ring around my coneflower because it was flopping, so I'm going to remove that. And now all I'm going to do is follow each of these flower stalks down to the base, and I'm going to use my hand pruners again, and I'm going to cut them. When it comes back to cutting back perennials, I feel strongly that you want to do it when the time is right for you. And for me, the time is right now because I have so many flower beds, and I don't want to be overwhelmed and stressed with having to tackle all the beds as soon as my first frost hits. And here in New Hampshire, zone 5B, my first frost could hit sometime within the next 3 weeks or so. So I want to be ahead of the game because I know that there are a lot of beds to tackle. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to be cutting back all of this green material from my coneflowers. It's a great time of year for me to be collecting green materials for my compost pile. When all the leaves start falling, what I like to do is I use a leaf shredder and I shred up all my leaves into small pieces, and then I mix all of those small sized leaves with these cut up pieces of green material or yard waste. I add water and I mix it in my compost bin. And I have made a bunch of videos showing you my process for composting. And I love composting. I think it's a great way to add back nutrients into our yard, into the landscape. And it's really a free way to make your own fertilizer. Another great thing about those leaves is they don't end up in the landfill. They end up in the compost bin and then eventually back in my flower beds. So I mentioned earlier that when all the leaves fall, I like to blow them off the lawn. Initially though, I like to lay a big tarp on my lawn, blow all the leaves onto that tarp, and that's what I take for using in my compost bin. And then whatever few leaves remain in the flower beds, those are the ones that I end up blowing out into the woods. But that's hard to do if I have all this plant material in here. I want you to notice I am leaving the leaves here of my echinacea or coneflower because they're not very tall, and for right now I'm okay with leaving them here. On another day I can always come back, maybe even after a freeze hits, and I can cut back all of this material here, which is a lungwort. I can come in here and I can cut back all of the coneflower, but at least the tall flower stalks have been removed. Another plant that's right here, that was right next to my coneflower, a little too close if you ask me, are my peonies, and you can see the leaves do not look good at all on them. They are ready to be cut back. I'm just going to be following the leaves down to the base, and I'm going to cut using my pruners. I'm looking at the leaves. There's no powdery mildew. They've just gone by, that's all. So I'm going to cut these into small pieces as well. Over here are black-eyed Susan or rudbeckia. You can see they still have a few blooms on them, but in this flower bed, that's the only thing that has color right now. I don't want to come back in another week or two to cut these back. Now is the time to cut them back. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to follow them all the way down to the base of the flower stalk, and we're going to cut them. And when it comes to leaving things like the leaves on this plant, the leaves over here, many times in the past, I've actually left them there because they add protection to the plant during the late winter, early spring months when we're still getting those frosts. So there's a great likelihood that I won't come in and cut these back. It depends on my time and if I feel like cutting them back or not. I've done it both ways, and both ways have worked for me. I haven't lost perennials the years that I've cut the plants back. Now I know the birds love to eat the seeds off of this plant, and I have a bunch of rudbeckia next to my garage. I'm going to leave those flower heads there so that the birds can feast on those seeds. So I'm just following the flower stalk down, and I'm making my cuts. In case you're wondering why am I cutting these pieces down into small pieces like this, they will break down a lot quicker the smaller the pieces are in the compost bin. Now, let's say you don't want to do that and you just take all of this and you throw it into your compost heap. It will eventually break down. It might just take longer. So if you want to get into composting, but this seems like too much work, don't let that deter you. I want to encourage you actually to get into composting. So if you want to just take your yard waste and just throw it in a big pile, green materials, brown materials, whatever you have on hand, that's totally fine. You will eventually end up with black gold. Rudbeckia is another plant that I have left for the birds before all over my yard, and I ended up with a ton of baby plants all over my yard. And I know in some cases that's not a bad thing. For example, if you have like a wild flower patch. But again, if you have flower beds that are not very big, or flower beds that you want to have some sort of unity or some sort of form to, then letting all these flowers just go to seed everywhere can end up being a little bit of a hassle come next spring when you have all these little baby plants that you have to deal with in your flower beds. The next thing we're going to cut back is the Stella daylily. Now, it is still putting out some flowers and some flower buds, but at this point, it's okay. We're going to go ahead and we're just going to cut it all the way down. Daylilies are one of those plants that can harbor disease during the winter months. So you definitely want to make sure you get after your daylilies and other plants like I mentioned earlier in the video and I put up on the screen. On a different day, I can bring you into my hosta garden because all of those hosta will need to be cut back. And I prefer to cut back my hosta before a freeze hits them because cutting back hosta after a freeze is not fun at all. One thing to be careful of this time of year is when you're cutting things, first of all, you don't want to cut your hands, but also there are a lot of bees around doing what they need to do this time of year. Just be careful because I know while I've been working in my flower beds, I have had some encounters with bees being inside my plants. So just be mindful of that. Okay, I have my work cut out for me. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing that I just showed you with all of those plants in the rest of this flower bed. And I'll show you how everything looks when I'm all done. Another bed cleanup is complete. I am so happy to get this chore done. Now, even though this flower bed is clean, there are still other things I want to do in this flower bed, so you'll have to watch in future videos for those. And I'll go over some of that today. But let me take you in for a closer look just so you can see how everything looks. I have a clematis here, and that needs to be cut down to the ground. Eventually, when the frost hits this plant over here, which is the fringed leaf bleeding heart, that will get cut down. But for right now, it's still looking pretty. And the same is true for my annuals, the wax begonias and the vinca. They still look very pretty. And if you remember from previous videos, these were plants that I started from seed, and I collected the seeds of these plants from last year. So I'm going to keep them here until a frost hits those. And we still have another fringed bleeding heart on this side of this area. We're going to leave that there because it's actually still blooming. Look how much cleaner this flower bed looks. I just love a nice clean flower bed this time of year. There's a hydrangea there in the center, and we're going to leave it as is. I have not been very good about pruning that hydrangea. We'll be getting after that next spring. And right over here is another clematis that also will get cut back on a different day. As we make our way in this direction, you can see a lot of things have been cut back and cleaned up. I have a tall phlox right over here. I am letting it stay as is because I want to collect the seeds from it. And when I collect the seeds from it, I will be sure to make a video showing you my process. And in this flower bed, there are 2, maybe 3 roses. I will be removing the roses, and I'm going to be moving them into my backyard where I have a rose garden. I left a few of the black-eyed Susans over here and in other places around my hydrangea because I am planning on actually moving those. I have an area which I call the bay window bed, and they're going to be getting moved to there. So there are a couple over there as well. In this flower bed, I have a number of Shasta daisy, and these are called the ox-eye Shasta daisy. On a different day, I had come in here and I had cut them way back. You look how big this patch is. I have this Shasta daisy in a number of areas in this flower bed. I will be removing those Shasta daisies. I'll be potting them up, adding them as part of my backyard plant nursery, and I'm going to be replacing them with a shorter variety of Shasta daisy. I have a large number of the old-fashioned bleeding heart that are here. They were cut back a while ago. I do want to come in and I want to divide those on a different day. There are a number of clematis also in this area here. And I want to show you something. Since I don't know what kind of clematis plants I have, I've always just left them as is. You'll see that with this one here, it has a lot of top growth, but it doesn't have any growth at the bottom here. That tells me that this is the type of clematis plant that should be cut back to the base. So on a different day, I'll be coming in and cutting that plant down to the base. Last year, we removed every other Stella daylily. There was one over here, there was one over here, and then I kept one, and it's right there, but it's been cut back. And what I did last year was I then added rudbeckia or black-eyed Susans, but I left spaces in between. And this year, I'll be adding a different perennial in those open spaces. So again, over here is a Stella daylily. Here's another rudbeckia that we added last year. Stella daylily, blank space. And that pattern repeats itself throughout this bed. And I'm thinking I'm going to add most likely a liatris, a purple colored liatris, which I have a number of. I had dug them up. I got them actually for free off Facebook Marketplace, and they're currently in pots, and I think they would look really pretty right there. You'll notice that this area here is mulched, but then the mulching ended here. And it's partially because I couldn't get in there to put the mulch down. Well, now I can get in here, so I'll be coming in and adding a nice layer of mulch, and that's going to happen pretty soon as well. It is a great time of year to get out in your gardens. The weather is cooling, but it's not too cold yet. Get out there, start cleaning up your flower beds, start dividing, moving perennials around. Check the clearance racks. Now is a great time to get plants at a very discounted rate and start planning for next year. I really hope that this video inspired you, or maybe it gave you some ideas. As always, if you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear from you. And remember, I'm going to be doing a lot more in these flower beds, so be on the lookout for those in future videos. And until the next video, make it a great day with gardening.